Okay, so welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and in particular to the Birabirigal clan of the Darug people on whose land I'm located today. Our presenter today, Nilay Ozok Gundogan, is Associate Professor of Ottoman and Middle East History at Florida State University. Her research centers on the questions of modern state-making, property regimes, and intercommunal conflict and coexistence in the borderlands of modern empires. She also writes about the question of methodology in Kurdish studies. Her first monograph, The Kurdish Nobility in the Ottoman Empire, Loyalty, Autonomy and Privilege, was published by Edinburgh Uni Press in 2022 and received the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association's 2023 Book Prize. Her current manuscript, Forging Empire, Mineral Extraction, State Making, and the Colonization of Ottoman Kurdistan, 1720 to 1870, examines Ottoman colonization of Kurdistan through the study of mineral extraction at the Keban and Ergani mining region in the 18th century. Her paper today is titled The Beginning of the Endgame, The Road to the 1895 Armenian Massacres in Ottoman Palu. Nilay, over to you.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much for putting together this event. I am really happy to be presenting today. I would like to share my screen with you. We do it like how many times a day, but it still is a hassle. All right, okay. So here, it's just like a nice, cute painting by Clara Burton, who was like, traveler missionary in the region that I will be talking about today. I would like to open up with a petition. I am particularly interested in petitions as an historian. In August 1865, two Armenians named Avedis and Mardiros from Palu, a district in the eastern part of the Ottoman Empire in Kurdistan, sent a petition to the Imperial Center claiming to represent the district's inhabitants. They complained that despite numerous appeals to the provincial governor, they had received no response. They described their miserable conditions, waiting in inns for a reply, typical of such petitions which often used quite vivid language. But what exactly were they asking from the Ottoman administrators? The core of their petition addressed two issues. First, the matter of land sales, following the state's confiscation of hereditary lands belonging to Kurdish nobility. And secondly, the issue of noksana arz, which is a form of agrarian due collected by Kurdish noble base from the local population. The petition was among hundreds housed in the Ottoman archives documenting agrarian conflicts in Palu during the latter half of the 19th century. The claims of the Armenian population regarding lands they purchased from confiscated Kurdish noble lands, the resulting changes in land ownership, and the issues of surplus extraction were key concerns for both local and imperial authorities during this turbulent period. Fast forward to 1896. In May, approximately 6 months after violent massacres of Armenians in various parts of the empire, including Palu, British Consul Hallward described the dire state of Armenians. He reported that Armenians in Palu and elsewhere had been reduced almost to serfdom, lacking tools, livestock, and land to reap harvests, making it seemingly impossible for them to survive another winter under such circumstances. Reports like these widely acknowledge that the pogroms of 1895 had led to widespread dispossession, poverty, and famine, particularly affecting rural Armenians in Kurdistan. So what processes led to the transformation of certain sectors of Palu's Armenian population, once major purchasers of land from the 1840s onwards, into targets of violence and dispossession by 1895? The massacres against Armenians throughout the empire began shortly after Sultan Abdülhamit II accepted a reform program for Ottoman Armenians. While this triggered the attacks, it was local power dynamics that ultimately facilitated the unfolding violence. Socioeconomic transformations in Palu following Ottoman state policies of centralization aimed at asserting authority in Kurdistan, and they changed land ownership and power dynamics in the rural sector and paved the way for violence against Armenians in the late 19th century. Today, in this talk, I will delve into these changes and provide a microhistory of the processes that led to the massacres in Palu, focusing particularly on shifts in land ownership from the 1840s to the 1890s. So let me start with a little bit of information about Palu. So Palu was a Kurdish emirate that came under the Ottoman rule in the 16th century within the context of the Ottoman-Safavid Wars. I will talk about this later a little bit more. Palu's old town was built on the west and east sides of a steep hill on the banks of the fertile areas of Murat River. Oops, all right, this is here. I don't know if you can see my screen, but this is where Palu is located. The summit of this cone-shaped hill was about 4,000 feet and was crowned by an Urartu-era castle. The famous 17th century traveler Evliya Çelebi poetically likened the castle to the head of a snake reaching up to the sky, Murat River surrounding the hill being the snake's curled up body. It was so unreachable, he noted, that even Tamerlane bypassed it. When Evliya Çelebi visited the castle, Ibrahim Bey, who was then Hakim, or the ruler of the emirate, was there with his armed forces. In addition to a mosque, castle featured an arsenal, cellars, and cisterns. It was really like a medieval fortress town. Oops, I'm sorry. Palu also has a unique place in Armenian ethno-national imagination as an ancient Armenian city. It is significant in Armenian historical memory because it was the homeland of Mesrop Mashtots, the saint who invented the Armenian alphabet and translated the Bible from Syriac and Greek into Armenian. In the words of Armenian ecclesiast Karakin Sırvantyans, who toured the region in 1878, the Palu Castle was the womb of Armenian enlightenment. In the 20th century, Palu's place as a key site of historic Armenia was tarnished by grim memories of the pogroms of 1895 and the Armenian genocide of 1915. Armenian villages had been reduced to ruined churches, cemeteries, and houses. This is the ruins of the old city of, old town of Palu. In Kurdish historical memory, Palu's significance stems mainly from its being the hometown of Sheikh Said, the famous Kurdish leader of the Naqshbandi Khalidiya religious order. Born in 1865, the Sheikh was one of the leaders of the 1925 Kurdish nationalist revolt against the Turkish government. The state's response to the revolt was brutal. It even used its air force against the rebels. Despite its significance during the rebellion, the contemporary Palu has lost its Kurdish character and is now a center of Turkish Islamic conservatism. The first modern Ottoman census of 1830 or 1831 was conducted in Palu in 1841 and provided the first systematic data about Palu's population. According to this census, Palu's total population was around 45,000. The 1881-82 census data shows its population as 50,000, a little over 50,000. The overwhelming majority of Palu's Christian population were Armenians. They had 4 churches in the city center, each with a neighborhood that had grown around it. Mostly traders and manufacturers, in the 1870s, the Armenians had about 200 looms, a dyeing establishment, and a tannery, and they manufactured cloth using native cotton. So the majority of Palu's population, however, was made of the agrarian inhabitants of more than 300 villages that were spread out over the plain between the mountain ranges. Approximately 50 of these villages located on the north and southwest of the Murat or Aratzani River contained Armenian populations of varying sizes as well as Kurdish settlements. You see the river here. The majority of Palu's Muslim population consisted of Kurdish, Kurmanji-speaking, and Zazaki-speaking groups. Some lived as settled agrarian pastoral groups in villages, but there were other groups of nomadic or semi-nomadic Kurds in the greater Palu area. Karaçor in the northwest, Karabegan and Veshan in the south, and Sivan and Gökdere and Karabegan in the south. Semi-nomadic Kurds inhabiting these areas moved to mountain pastures with their herds of sheep, horses, and cattle in the summer. They produced significant amounts of dairy, which they traded with the settled villagers around the river, Murat River. In the 19th century, agriculture was at the center of Palu's economy. Grains, specifically wheat, cotton, and rice, were cultivated on the fertile lands on the northern bank of the Murat River. The majority of the agrarian population worked as sharecroppers, who paid half of the harvest on top of the tithe to the landowning bags, and the ratio of tithe really varied across the region and throughout the empire. More than anything else, it was Palu's agrarian potential that brought it to the Ottoman administrators' attention in the mid-19th century. You see, this map shows the Kurdish emirates in the 16th century. When Kurdistan came under the Ottoman rule in the 16th century, the Kurdish elites of the existing principalities in the area were incorporated into the Ottoman realm mainly through a system that recognized their hereditary rulership. Palu was one of the 5 emirates that were granted a special position as hükümet. You see Palu here, but there are others, underlined here. Places show the Kurdish emirates with varying degrees of fiscal and administrative autonomy. So Palu was one of these 5 emirates that were granted a special position as hükümet. Hükümet literally means government, but in this context, it refers to this particular political administrative system. Hükümet was how the Ottoman state recognized hereditary rights of the Kurdish begs over their dominions. What separated the hükümets from the more typical Ottoman sancaks and other hereditary Kurdish estates was that they were designated as mefruzul kalem and maktul kadem in the administrative system. These terms kind of could be confusing, but I am using these terms, I'm referring to them to talk about the types of autonomy and the types of privileges that the Kurdish ruling houses had in the Ottoman realm. Mefruzul kalem, this one here, refers to the hükümet's protection from the tamars. Tamars are the land grants to the Ottoman cavalrymen by the state in return for military service. With this immunity came another. Palu and other Kurdish hükümets were free of tahrirs. And literally tahrirs mean enregisterment. And these are the Ottoman system of periodical surveying of population, land, and other sources of revenue. Whereas the second one here, maktul kadem, meant that both military and civilian Ottoman administrators were barred from having any authority in the emirate, which meant that both tax collectors and the janissary corps were, they were not allowed. So these 2 concepts indicate that Palu nobility they were granted special privileges, which gave Kurdistan, it was like specific to Kurdistan as a region that they maintained this particular configuration of autonomy. So Palu was one of these places where the rulership was tied to a Kurdish family in a hereditary fashion in the 16th century. Sasha mentioned the title of my book. It is The Kurdish Nobility. In the book, I talk in great detail about what makes this particular group of people nobility, particularly because in Ottoman historiography, there is this meta-narrative that hereditary nobility did not exist in the Ottoman Empire. So in the book, I make a counter-argument arguing that these were nobles and their privileges were recognized in a hereditary fashion by the Ottoman state. And this is the Temlikname, meaning the original written document that recognized this particular elite group as a privileged nobility in the Ottoman Empire. So this was granted to a beg. Beg is the noble title, alternatively bey or beg, that was used for the Kurdish noble men. And this was granted to Cemşit Beg by the Ottoman Sultan during his Eastern campaign. He was the founding figure of the Palu Emirate within the Ottoman realm. And the privileges granted to Cemşit Beg and his descendants decreed by the Sultan reflected the Ottoman imperial state's recognition of the Beg's existing authority over these territories. And the document is quite explicit about it. The aforementioned Begs of Kurdistan, it says, had held and possessed these territories and castles from the times immemorial, which had been their yurts and ocaks. And the Temlikname further stated that the Kurdish Begs, aforementioned castles and territories that they inherited from their ancestors, would stay in their control. So I can go on and on about this particular document. This is the descendants of the Palu noble family. They gave this one to me when I was doing oral history interviews with them in 2013. So from the point that I really want to emphasize here is that the Palu Beg's privileges stood on top two pillars. The first one is economic and concerned the propriety rights of the Begs over the land and its surplus. And the second one concerned their political and administrative authority over a delimited territory, meaning it's economic and it is also territorial. There is a lot of discussion about the autonomy of Kurdistan in the Ottoman realm. So in this particular context, Palu Begs had both economic autonomy and also they had control over the territory. So from the 1830s onwards, the Ottoman state embarked upon a process of modernization and centralization of its administration in the periphery within the context of the Tanzimat or reorganization program. So up until the 1830s, specifically 1840s, the Ottoman state really had no problem with this particular document, meaning this was renewed several times by different sultans because this was specifically indicated in this document saying that like my descendants should really respect this document and recognize their hereditary privileges. But with the 1830s, we see that Ottoman state is in a new context. Now it's modernizing its institutions, it's centralizing its administration in its provinces and its peripheries. So then it is for the first time in this context that the notion of privilege, which indicates economic rights and also territorial autonomy, turns into a problem in the minds of the Ottoman administrators. But what did hereditary privileges of the Kurdish nobility entail in this time period? In the 1840s, the Bey's hereditary rights as the rulers were defined in an age-old imperial decrees, and they entailed inalienable authority over their dominions, immunity from the Ottoman surveyors, the right to bear armed forces, and being exempt from various taxes. This is literally like the set of privileges, or from the perspective of the Ottoman state, the set of problems that they feel like they have to intervene and change in this new context of modernization. And they had several discussions in the highest council in the imperial capital about how to do this. How can we really confiscate the privileges of the lands and also other privileges of these noble group and others without really creating a big resistance in the region. But while these discussions were going on, the news of a violent confrontation between one of the Kurdish villages of Palu, the name of the village is Weshin, and the Hakim of the Emirates arrived at the capital. And the Bey is Abdullah Bey. In 1848, Abdullah Bey, this noble Kurdish Bey, went to this village to collect 4 years of back taxes, and he demanded these taxes in the form of clarified butter. As you can imagine, this is like a pastoralist, semi-pastoralist area, and they pay their taxes in the form of dairy. And the villagers responded by opening fire, and the next day Abdullah Bey came with his men and set the village on fire. And this violent encounter in Weshin triggered a long process, like a legal case, that was eventually transferred to the capital. And at the end of a long investigative process, Abdullah Beg was found guilty and died in exile in Tekfur'da, which is about 900 miles away from his homeland. Now it's interesting, let me give you a little bit of context here. This case is the reason why I started to get interested in this particular noble family. And it is interesting because this moment refers to a moment of transition, a moment of transformation. I will elaborate in a minute why it is the case. But this is how I got interested in the history of this family. And I went backwards to the 18th century to the 16th century to see how their nobility started. And then all the way until the end of the 19th century to understand how the notion of nobility changed with modernization. And in fact, the 1895 massacres, which is going to be my actual focus today, constitutes the last chapter of my book, from a context where nobility started to a context where it became a part of a violent ethno-religious conflict. So the Ottoman state took this incident, this moment, as an opportunity to put into place its grand scheme to make the changes in the Palubegs' long-lived status as a hereditary noble group. Within a year, this violent encounter would cost the Bey his position as hakim and his landholdings, and he was exiled. And he died in exile in a year. But the incident provided the Ottoman state with an opportunity, and they went ahead and initiated a drastic change, and they confiscated Abdullah Beg's property, this particular Beg's property, land holdings. But then they expanded it. They decided to confiscate all the land holdings of this particular noble family. Now, this temlikname, this particular imperial decree is on the screen. You see it. This is literally the Ottoman empires or Ottoman sultans' commitment to recognize their autonomy. And this particular local incident in Weshan becomes a reason for the Ottoman state to confiscate the entire land holdings of this noble family. And in the book, I elaborate on the negotiations after the confiscation process started. So there's a lot of back and forth. So the actual form or the actual scheme of land confiscation changed a lot in response to the demands of particular groups. But the final shape of the program was this. According to this plan, the lands of the Palubegs were to be divided into 3 parts. One part granted to the Kurdish nobles without any payment. The remaining portion was to be divided into 2, one half being sold to the Muslim producers and the other half being sold to the non-Muslim producers. I'm using the terminology that the Ottoman administrators used when they come up with this plan. They used terms like Muslim and non-Muslim because this is how Ottomans talked about their subject populations to a great extent when it comes to issues like that, because it didn't really mean much whether you're Armenian or Greek. What mattered was you were non-Muslim and your taxation was dependent on that. So you were not Muslim. So the arrangement resulted in drastic changes within the locality, specifically in terms of the local property structures and power relations revolving around land ownership. The confiscation of the Beg's lands brought to the fore discussions about the legitimacy of their fiscal privileges over land in its revenues, and this created growing conflicts, particularly with the Armenian population of the emirate. And in the decades following the decision to confiscate the Beg's lands, Palu was embroiled in a fierce struggle between parties seeking shares of this newly available land. The council's decision to sell land to Muslim and non-Muslim inhabitants with a moderate down payment had energized certain sectors of the Armenian population of Palu, and it was largely those Armenians, mostly based in the imperial capital, who helped keep the issue alive through their regular petitions, hence the petition with which I opened up this talk. So let me give you a little bit of more information about the societal hierarchies in Palu around this time. From the second half of the 18th century on, Armenian society in Palu's countryside was noticeably stratified. This is something that gets lost a lot in the discussions about the history of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. We often talk about them as a monolithic group. But in discussions around the sales of the confiscated land, one group was generically defined as sharecroppers, or in Ottoman, Maraba or Ortakçı, both terms were used. But this group was not homogeneous. So careful reading of hundreds of documents shows that from the perspective of the Ottoman state, Maraba Ortakçı could mean a couple of different things. So in these documents, Ottoman documents, it was used, this term, this sharecropping concept was used in a way that concealed the differences between groups that had different relations to land ownership and labor organization. Careful reading of archival documents shows that sharecroppers actually consisted of two very different groups, landless cultivators and the group akin to like middle peasantry. I define this group as middle peasantry in the book. The latter group were those who either had already acquired land through lease or sale and were seeking an official imprint for these sales, or who had enough capital to buy land through the new land program. So we're looking at a particular group that can actually purchase land, regardless of its size. So it's not a coincidence that when the begs, the Kurdish noble begs, talked about those who sought to buy their lands, of course, they're complaining about it, they referred to, I'm quoting, some reaya, they are basically referring to producers here, who are farmers, çiftçi, and sharecroppers, maraba, which are two different terms. One refers to specific type of labor, sharecroppers, and the other one is farmers, which implies that they are tilling their own land. The former wanted to buy land, acquire deeds for land they already owned, and prevent the begs from buying land from the market allocated to the reaya. The latter mostly raised questions about agrarian relations of production, including overtaxation, double taxation, and sharecropping, and also a lot of violence that is related to these processes of surplus extraction. Even after the land had changed lands, cultivators complained that the new owners continued the oppressive practice of sharecropping. And in addition to these two groups, there was another group that wanted to purchase the newly available land. These were wealthy Armenian notables, sometimes described as çorbacıs, who took it upon themselves to bring issues related to the land purchases to the Ottoman state's attention. They had accumulated wealth through trade, money lending, or doing artisanal work like barbering or carpentry. They were based in Hans, urban inns, known for hosting the activities of money lenders or creditors, such as Çukurçeşme or Yenihan in Istanbul, and its economically vibrant districts. You would remember the petition that the vignette at the beginning, they also referred to the inns that they were staying, which is another indication of this characteristic of this particular socioeconomic group. So this group comprised people who had served as financiers and guarantors for the Palu begs and other notables for the tax farming leases of the 1820s through the late 1830s, and their land claims dated from the early years of the Tanzimat, the reform program, when they were financiers for tax farmers. Now, why do I emphasize this? Because oftentimes we talk about the Muslim, say Kurdish and Armenian groups in the region as if they were isolated boxes. They did not have a lot of connections because basically Ottoman society was a hierarchical society on the basis of religion. But in the book, I show a lot of examples, a lot of situations in which Armenians and Kurds, they were a part of a network, an economic network, and they often relied on each other. And the conflicts did not really depend on ethnic identity in every case throughout the history of this region. So as I mentioned before, the begs, the Kurdish nobles, frequently use their property, including their land, as collateral when borrowing money from these sarrafs, creditors. Almost all of them were Armenians. And in the face of the begs' inability to pay their debts, the sarrafs demanded they sell their property. So there is an integrated system, economic system. But now going back to the issue of land confiscation. So in the book, I elaborate on what happens after the land was confiscated, because we rarely ask this question. We talk about Armenian dispossession, but we don't really talk about the situations in which they were actual components of land purchases or, you know, the land markets in the region. So I wanted to shed a little bit more light on that. Throughout the 1850s and 60s, these Polo-Armenians based in Istanbul, they sent the Meclis-i Vala, which is the central, the key council that took care of the issues related to the reform program. They sent detailed accounts of the land sales and agrarian relations of production in Polo. In most cases, they describe themselves as the representatives of certain villages and raise specific questions about land sales or the problems of the sharecroppers in those places. Along with this role of representation, it's also clear that they had a vested interest in land sales. For the next few decades, they acted as a conduit, conveying issues of local nature to the imperial center, while voicing their personal agendas about land acquisition. So on the one hand, they talk about their particular economic interests, but there is something bigger than that. They claim, and they did, represent Armenian villages in their economic dealings with the Kurdish begs after their lands were confiscated. So, I mean, it's no surprise that the begs, the Kurdish nobles, used their local influence and connections with local administrators to repurchase the land that had been opened up for the ahali's purchase. And there are a lot of cases about that it was specifically stated in the government scheme that this was, you know, devoted to the Armenians, and the begs were not allowed to purchase them. But of course, local connections, power configurations worked otherwise. The letters they sent mentioned instances of Kurdish begs and ağas, referring to the tribal chiefs, dividing the lands among each other or registering land with their family members to avoid confiscation. But then reading these narratives of this possession, I realized that there is another underlying story here, which is about land acquisition. But unless you read these documents quite carefully, the whole story shows us this possession because these petitions complain about this possession. But in reality, I noticed that there was actually a lot of land purchases happening around the same time. So the begs' encroachment over land in contravention of the new land program was only one side of the coin. In reality, land sales and the resulting changes in property and land relations were much more complex. The picture that emerges from these complaints indicates that even though the begs sought to maintain their historical rights over land and prevent land sales, sales were underway and the begs' hereditary proprietorship, what a difficult word to say, was being eroded by land purchases. And this is from my book, based on a particular document that I will elaborate on now. So at some point, the Ottoman state appointed like inspectors, administrators, title deed staff, like people who would investigate what was actually happening in terms of land purchases. And at one point around 1860, they sent someone called Latif Efendi, and he was a Polo-based provincial official, so he was appointed for this job to investigate. And he provided the council with a fairly detailed account of the finances related to the land sales. I mean, there is so much to unpack here, and I'm not going to go into details. I'm going to just highlight a few points for the argument that I would be making later today. The report clearly shows that as of 1860, nearly a decade after the initial land allocation plan was issued, land sales were underway. So change was happening, you know. The slowness of the sales or problems associated with the begs reacquiring land is only one facet of the process. In the absence of systematic records, it's not clear how much land was actually sold and at what prices at a given time in a particular village. So those who are familiar with issues related to land ownership would know that especially in places like rural places, it's hard to keep records because I'm literally looking at a moments in which these records are being built, right? Because remember the previous formula that I mentioned, this region was out of Ottoman state's record keeping. So we don't have systematic information about how things really were before the reforms of the mid-century. So, but despite this, judging from the down payments made for the land, and the government's land program was working, and buyers unrelated to the begs invested significant amounts of money buying land from the treasury. Regardless of the Beg's ongoing claims to the land and their efforts to rebuy it, other people also bought lands and demanded title deeds for lands they were already tilling. So there's a lot of discussion here about basically the Armenians who bought lands and those who claim to represent certain villages. They're literally inviting the Ottoman administration to implement its reform program and help it establish a certain form of legality concerning private land ownership after the confiscation of the Palu Beg's lands. So the Begs still held a substantial portion of the land inherited from their ancestors. So I can't say that they lost all of their privileges, but they no longer had a legitimate claim to hereditary ownership over the entire Palu land and its produce. So we are looking at a moment in which a system that was established 3 centuries ago and worked without much change is now changing, okay? And we are looking at a particular group that are trying to get shares from this changing system in the 1850s and 60s. So from Abdullah Beg's death in 1849, Abdullah Beg is the one who attacked the village and started this whole process, to the 1870s, the Palu nobility's control over Palu's agrarian land came under attack on 2 fronts. First, from the Armenians of Palu, but mainly from the financial bourgeoisie who pushed for the sale of the lands. And the second source of attack is the imperial state, whose major preoccupation was maximizing the amount of tithes and other monies that accrued to the imperial treasury. Sorry, I just want to make sure that, oh, I didn't start my time. Okay, sorry. So as the land tenure changed, it inevitably affected the relations of production, because we are looking at an overwhelmingly agrarian society, and surplus extraction is at the heart of the issue. After the confiscation of the Beg's lands, these conflicts over the rural surplus were embodied in the concept of noksan ars, which is a type of agrarian dues the Begs collected from Palu's rural population. So it's actually, in essence, it's a specific term, right? The landholder, when they lease the land or when they have sharecroppers tilling the land, they charge them a particular fee because the soil loses its value. And, you know, that's a specific term for that. But then I realized that within this context, noksana ars lost its specific meaning and turned into an expression that symbolized all sorts of overtaxation, double taxation, unequal surplus extraction that was experienced by sharecroppers and others in Palu's agrarian landscape. So, but the problem here that I want to point out is that the problem was not just the Begs. Another reason for intensified exploitation was that the new purchasers of the confiscated land continued the existing terms of surplus extraction. Complaints about both Muslim and non-Muslim notables, I'm quoting, reached the imperial state. So the Muslim notables, I know who they are. These are Begs and the tribal chiefs who continued to hold large amounts of land. But then the documents refer to non-Muslim landowners as those wealthy Armenians who are the new landholders who purchased land from the confiscated land of the Begs. So both were accused of extracting unfair fees, while it's clear that it was primarily the Begs who imposed heavy dues in the rural sector. Nevertheless, while property relations were changing and more Armenian notables were acquiring land, the socioeconomic rift within the Armenian population of Palu grew conspicuously, creating issues within the Armenian population. So one thing that I want to emphasize here about this noksan ars, or overtaxation business, is that I have detailed figures in terms of how much money they charged, how much extra illegal taxation or overtaxation was put on the producers. And there's like a significant difference between the Muslim and non-Muslim villages in terms of how much noksan ars they paid. This might stem from a couple of things. Well, it can be about reporting, right? Maybe in Armenian villages, there is more reporting in terms of how much extra taxation they paid. But it can also be about a bigger section of the Armenian population being involved in agrarian production. So the difference between numbers might also indicate that. And it might also imply a degree of land acquisition among the agrarian populations, which I discussed previously as a stratified population anyways. I don't want to speculate, but these might be potential reasons for that discrepancy between the Muslim and non-Muslim. But we should also keep in mind the fact that, of course, we are looking at a hierarchical society in which the Kurdish nobles maintain the upper hand. So that might be related to the source of violence that was used against the non-Muslim groups. But so this is everything that I told you up to this point really constitutes 7 chapters in my book. I take it from the formation of the Kurdish nobles in the 16th century, and I bring it all the way until the 1890s and try to understand how all of this context in which I observe the building of a certain degree of legality with respect to private land ownership results in a moment of violence. Okay, that's the inquiry here. And the title that I have here, I'm not sure if I forgot it, but the beginning of Endgame indicates it's implying a relationship with the 1915 Armenian genocide. So that's what I am questioning here. But I don't see it as the beginning. In reality, in my narrative, it's the end of a story that I have been talking about for the past 3 centuries, from the making of the Kurdish nobles and the building of an unequal relationship in the agrarian sector and its transformation and dissolution with the Tanzimat reforms in the mid-century. But then in this context, against this background, how do we interpret the 1895 massacres in Palu? And I will tell you a little bit more about that. But I have to highlight this. I'm not a scholar of mass violence. That's not my specialty. The reason that I wanted to understand what happened in Palu in 1895 was because I wanted to understand the impact of agrarian relations and conflicts and how they factor in when this local conflict or local massacres happened in the fall of 1895. But there is a growing literature about the 1895 massacres. Prior to this past decade, people would almost always describe them as Hamidian massacres, referring to the Sultan Abdulhamid II's role. But more recent studies really try to complicate that and try to have a more complex account of this premeditated conflict. And also, up to this point, historians considered 1895 as in a linear fashion with 1915 Armenian genocide, but that linear account, that somehow teleological notion is also changing. There's really good scholars working on the 1895 in different parts of the empire. Mine is specifically on Palu in the long history of this region. So the period from the confiscation of the Palu Beg's lands in the 1850s through the 1880s was one of drastic transformation in terms of the Beg's position locally and their relations with the imperial state. So when they came under ideological and political attack in the Tanzimat context, it was the economic implications of their privileges that was the main problem for the government. But while the Begs lost some land, the government plan left 1/3 of their land intact. So this, along with the land they bought from the portions opened up for sale, meant they were by no means impoverished by the land confiscation process. So initially, the administrative transformations that came with the Tanzimat provided opportunities for the Palu Beys. There is an administrative process. They become local governors, right? The district governors, but the government seized that power as well after that. So by the 1890s, however, I noticed 2 processes, 2 rollbacks in 2 realms, a rollback in 2 realms that constitutes the Palu Beg's economic and political power, land ownership and provincial bureaucracy. So descendants of this noble family, they tried to seize their power back, okay? So they tried to reacquire the lands that they lost, and they also want to reestablish their kind of like a dynastic rule in their historic homeland. So according to a report prepared by a commission appointed by the Armenian National Assembly, in 1876, several Armenian villages were seized by Muslim notables of the district, and they came under the Beg's control. So from the 1840s until the I would say late 1870s, there is a process of negotiation back and forth, Armenians acquiring land. But starting from the 1880s, things are really changing in a negative way, and the Begs are trying to gain their lands back. So the Begs increased their efforts to regain that land. But the question for me was also, where is the Ottoman state? What is the position of the Ottoman state when the Begs are taking their lands back in this period? So from the 1870s onward, the character of Ottoman administration in the region really changed. The Treaty of Berlin, signed in 1878, meant that the administration of the region was now linked to its policies towards Armenian population. I'm going to talk for a few more minutes and then I will wrap up. Like literally 3-4 minutes, if that's okay. So this is now the context that we are looking at here is that by the 1890s, Armenian question was now defined as such. We are looking at a political problem that gained international character because the imperial powers, the British and the Russians, they are basically claiming to protect the non-Muslim populations of the empire, but there is also ongoing efforts coming from the Armenian community to end these land purchases and dispossession. So it's like a very kind of like a tense climate at so many different levels. On the one hand, there is the local context of land problem, but on the other hand, Armenians are being increasingly suspect in the eyes of the Ottoman state because they are becoming politicized, right? They are becoming politicized and they are building political organizations. And it is really interesting. There are certain Armenian villages, and Havav is one of them. All the different accounts, whether it is Ottoman or British or American missionary, they talk about these Armenian villages as enlightened places. Enlightened in the sense that, I mean, it's very, really, it was interesting to see missionaries' accounts because they were thinking like, these guys are so enlightened, they don't care about any religion, let alone being, you know, converted to Protestantism. So there was this like notion that these are like a more mobile community. They have a lot of connections with places outside of their district. And then they are bringing all these revolutionary ideas into Palu. So all these somehow resulted in the Ottoman state's framing of the Armenians, framing them as, and criminalizing them because of their perceived political activities. And it is interesting, we see a lot of accounts related to the Armenians. This is like one, I would say it's called the Palu Memorial, but it's in fact like a petition signed by, according to the British accounts, by almost 1,000 inhabitants of Palu, basically requiring reforms from the Ottoman government. So, but then the violence unfolded in a way in like both the city, Palu city, like the town, and also rural areas became the victims of violence. And there are really different accounts of the role of the Begs in the violent process. On the one hand, there are accounts of Begs trying to kind of like gain what they lost because of this opportunity provided this empire-wide violent massacres. So they particularly try to settle their accounts with specific villages that created troubles for them in the past 2-3 decades in terms of land purchases. But there are also accounts of certain Begs trying to protect Armenians during this context of violence. But there is also some evidence that Begs try to monetize protection, which is actually reminds me of the former position of the Begs as the protectors of the Armenians, and Armenians actually paid some money for that. So they're trying to rebuild their legitimacy and protect the Armenians while also trying to take what they lost as a result of the land confiscation. So the end result is the moment of 1895 kind of reduced the Armenians into poverty. okay? They lost most of their land that they acquired. There is ample accounts of famine within the context of pogroms. There are accounts of course, forced conversion and extraordinary violence. But looking at 1896, like a couple of months after the beginning of the massacres, what we see is that things were reversed back to what they looked like in the I would say 1860s or 1870s, when Beys had started to lose their lands, but not entirely. So this moment of violence in the Ottoman Empire, it is an imperial context. There is like massacres and pogroms in different provinces of the empire against the Armenians. And in a quite standard fashion, you will see that there is like an established narrative coming from the Ottoman administrators to explain why violence unfolded. But my goal in the book was to understand how the processes of the past 5-6 decades factored in and turned this into a convenient moment for the Kurdish noble begs to gain what they lost previously. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really fascinating paper, and I'd like to open up for questions. And I'm going to shamelessly take advantage of my position as chair of the session and leap in with a question straight away. I'm a historian of the Habsburg Empire, and I was really struck by the parallels between the Armenian land purchases and Jewish land purchases in the eastern parts of the Habsburg Empire. And I guess two things come from that. One is, in the case of the Habsburg Empire, one of the motives for buying the land was the financial return, but the other one was that by becoming landowners, Jewish merchants and financiers were buying a kind of respectability, or trying to buy a kind of respectability by joining the landowning classes. And I was wondering whether there was a parallel here, or whether it was just a financial decision. And the other question I wanted to ask was, sometimes those land purchases were also associated with modernization, which undermined the position of the sharecroppers, or the tenant farmers on those lands. And is there something similar occurring in the case of Palu?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. Yeah, it is. I mean, there's, I think, a lot of parallels here in terms of how you frame the question. Even though the Armenians did not explicitly frame why they're buying land in that fashion, looking at the power configurations in relation to land ownership in the region, it is obvious that the only way to gain respect and change the established unequal relations and hierarchies in these places is to buy land, because really Kurds, like the Kurdish begs, maintained their control over land for 3 centuries. And when we look at them, they had, as I mentioned, they were this was like an integrated community of creditors, landowners, sharecroppers. So Armenians and Kurds were quite intermingled from that point of view, but there was hierarchy. So in the records that I read, I've never seen them framing this as such, but looking at the context, it's pretty obvious that they saw this as an opportunity to gain the upper hand in the local power configuration, because the beg's position, economic and political position, was embedded or attached to their land ownership. And it was defined as such and accepted as such by the Ottoman state. So absolutely, I mean, even though I don't see it as a clear statement, the context definitely indicates that. And as far as sharecropping is concerned, that's what I would have expected from Palu, right? From all the other examples, but that's definitely not the case. To the contrary, I think even though land ownership, I mean, land changed hands, sharecropping persisted. Sharecropping persisted, and the types of surplus extractions and ratios continued really without much change, whether it is the old landowner or the new landowner, whether it is like an Armenian landowner or a Kurdish landowner. Sharecropping continued to be the major form of labor used in the agrarian sector.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. Can I open the floor to other questions?
Sasha, can you hear
Libby,
me? And
yeah, go for
I
it.
just wanted to say, look, it's not my direct field, but I do teach this in some of Sasha's courses, and I just wanted to say what a fantastic case study this is as a means of explaining to undergrad students, I guess the nature of, yes, power and hierarchies in Ottoman society. I mean, I think you gestured towards this in the paper, but I wondered if you have a sort of encapsulation of whether, how characteristic is what is happening in this region with other regions in the Ottoman Empire. Is it particular to this region? Can you extrapolate or generalize from that? And that goes then to the value of this as sort of a teaching object as well.
Yeah. No, that's a great and also valid question, given that these massacres took place in so many places throughout the empire, and in similar ways in terms of the actors involved, in terms of how violence was framed and all of that. What I think there are some commonalities in terms of different parts of the empire, how this unfolded, specifically in relation to 1895. And I know that's not your specific question, but I will try to expand a little bit more later. So there are a lot of similarities in terms of this narrative of Armenians getting wealth, being too visible, becoming too powerful, and really disturbing the existing hierarchies, and then attracting a lot of attention and a lot of rage from the old elites of the places. So there are similarities from around the empire. In fact, I was someone actually, Yele Verhey, he wrote a dissertation comparing all the places where 1895 massacres took place, and there are a lot of similarities. In my case, I think what my case shows to a great extent is something that was not studied that much, which is the rural sector. Because when it comes to 1895, the majority of the studies focus on the city centers and how violence took place. But in this case, agrarian sector, the agrarian conflicts are at the heart of the issue, because my begs, my Kurdish nobles, they really never wanted to be a town-based elite group. They acquired their power from the agrarian sector. They were based in the rural parts of Palu. That's where they wanted to live. And in fact, there are instances of Armenian villages, they're trying to kick them out. They're trying to seize their mansions because they are so visible in the rural sector. So from that point of view, it's not unique, but it's understudied. Let me put it this way. But there is something unique that you wouldn't see in all parts of the empire when it comes to the Kurdish nobles. That might give some hints as to how we can study this, whether we can generalize from this, which is this is like an elite group with a longevity. And that really changes the narrative quite a bit, because their claims to land is so strong, their claims to land is so legitimate for several centuries, that changing it became so conflicted and so tense that when that one historian describes as climate of violence around 1895, when that imperial and regional climate of violence was in place, land conflicts definitely factored in, and that I would describe as not a uniqueness, but a specificity of this region because of the entrenchedness of the Kurdish nobility's land holdings.
Thank you. So fascinating.
Absolutely. And I was thinking the same thing, Libby, that we might have to revisit some of the material we're using in our in our courses. Look, this is absolutely fascinating, and I have other questions I'd love to ask, but unfortunately we're running to the end of the hour. So please join me in thanking Nilay for an absolutely fascinating paper. Really, really, really interesting. Just before everyone goes, a quick note that our next paper will be on Friday, the 17th of May, at the usual time of 10 a.m. And once again, it will be online only. Our speaker, Justin Pigott from Leicester University, will talk on Christian slavery, enslavement and ownership in early Byzantium. And we hope to see you then. And until then, I hope everyone has a great weekend.
You.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye.